Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. We'll begin reading at verse 8 and go through verse 12 as we begin. Very familiar story. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans, and remember that word in the context means wise men or magicians or spiritual advisors in this context with Babylon. So these are people who were kind of, shall we say, colleagues of Daniel in a sense, and colleagues of Daniel's three Hebrew friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews, that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So essentially, here's what was happening. Nebuchadnezzar had built this statue. We talked about it last week, and there was this demand that every time people heard the music, you would bow down to the statue. And it really didn't matter if you thought this was a good idea or not. If you valued your head where it was, you did it, right? Because this is the most powerful man in the world at that point. And so that's what people did. When the music started, everyone dutifully fell in line to bow down before this statue that he had built, except for these three men. Now, let me just interrupt you here, or interrupt the flow of thought. Daniel's not mentioned in the story. We don't know where he is. There's been speculation, but that's all it is. He might have been in a different part of the world traveling. Nobody knows. But if you ask me where Daniel is, I don't know. Yeah. So that's been a question that's been asked, and he simply doesn't appear here. So we don't know. And so you've got these three men. When everybody else bows down, they refuse to do it, and they're doing it in a public setting. They're staying upright, and they are disobeying, again, a command from the most powerful man in the world. And in the ancient world, and I think you all understand this, disobeying a king was a very dangerous thing to do. You can yell at the president here. You know, you might get a knock on your door from the Secret Service, depending what you say. But people do it, right, in our country. They do it. In the ancient world, it wasn't like that. If you disrespected a king, you could wind up dead. And just in case the king, Nebuchadnezzar, forgot it, he had a group of these advisors who reminded him of it. Again, verse 12, here's what they said to him. There are certain Jews who you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, and they name them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So right in that little verse, there's two charges, two accusations they make against these three Jewish men. Number one, that they didn't show gratitude or thankfulness toward the king. What do they say? There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. In other words, you put them in high office, and look at, they're not respecting you. And the second accusation was, not only were they not grateful to the king for what he had done for them, they didn't respect the gods that he had. That's the rest of the verse said, they do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And so essentially what these men are doing was accusing these three Hebrew men of being disloyal to the king himself, being disloyal to Nebuchadnezzar, right? You appointed them. They don't serve your gods. They refuse to bow to your statue. Now we look at that, we think, well, this is stupid anyway. Nobody builds a statue for people to bow to. But I want to give you just a little bit of a historical sociology lesson. And we kind of touched a little bit on this last week as well. One of the reasons that Nebuchadnezzar would have built this statue in the first place was because under his rule, Babylon was growing. He was a king who was always out conquering new territories. We talked about that. The nation was growing, expanding. New peoples were being brought in all the time. And when you bring in a lot of new people from foreign cultures, there's not always a lot that holds them together, right? Because they have different language, different background. And so part of what he's doing here, and people back then would have understood this, he wants to provide a point of unity for all these people who are very, very different, to have a centralized location to be brought together and say, this is what we as Babylonians are about. In other words, you're not part of your old nation anymore. You are Babylonian. And part of the reason he was doing this was because unless the people in a nation are unified around certain beliefs, right? We have to have a set of common beliefs. If you don't have some degree of that, eventually that nation is going to fall apart, right? If we're all doing our own thing, if we all like, well, I don't, there's no cohesion. Now, obviously we can disagree that that Nebuchadnezzar had a good idea or a bad idea, making himself the center of the unity, right? But the point was, this was an attempt on his part to strengthen his nation because he needed something for all these people that were being brought into the empire, like these Jews had been brought in from the land of Israel, to say, hey, you're Babylonians now, this is your new identity, and I'm building this statue as a point of reference for you. And so for you to go against the unity of your new country was something that he would have taken seriously. And we say, well, that's crazy. Well, is it really? Now, yes, bowing to a statue is. But think about our own nation, right? And we count ourselves as being a progressive liberal democracy, whatever, right? But we have laws against betraying your country. If I go to some nation that is an enemy of the U.S. and I sell them our national secrets and I get caught, guess what? I'm going to get arrested and spend some quality time in prison, right? Or if what about a soldier on duty, right? And he deserts his post. He's going to pay a price. And so my point is, this idea of loyalty to your nation and to your people is something that's always been the case in just about every country in the world that I'm aware of. And you can't violate that without risking severe consequences, because every nation has a certain level of expectation that you're going to be loyal. You may not like your government. You may not appreciate your government. But if you do something to betray them, there's going to be a certain line you can cross where you're going to get in trouble. And so, and when you think of it that way, it kind of makes sense what these guys were doing with Nebuchadnezzar and this statue. We may not agree with it completely, but you get it, right? And so that's what Nebuchadnezzar's advisors, these Chaldeans, these wise men, these magicians, that's what they're thinking here when they come and they play tattletale on these three Hebrew men. Let's read again verse 10 and 11. You, O king, have made a decree, and remember now, the king represents Babylon, and so does his statue, that every man who hears the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoever does not, in other words, whoever doesn't obey the symbol of Babylon and its authority, whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Now, it doesn't say it this way exactly, but I can imagine, and I don't want to get political here, but just let me go a little bit here. I can almost hear the slant these accusations were taking. I'm making this up, and I could be wrong, and you can tell me afterward in discussion time, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of these guys were phrasing it along the lines of, Nebuchadnezzar, you brought these foreigners into our country, and you gave them the best that Babylon has to offer, and this is how they repay you? By disrespecting our nation and by rejecting what you've said. It doesn't say exactly that he used those words, but that's kind of human nature, right? You brought these people in, look what they're doing. And so there's actually an issue of patriotism here. So we look at this story and we judge Nebuchadnezzar as being this out-of-control megalomaniac, loving power, and he was. But there is more to it than that. There actually was a method to his madness. He had a reason for what he was doing. Patriotism, a unity of the people. And then there was something else, and I've touched on this in other teachings about the ancient world. And that was this. In almost every nation in the ancient world, people believed that even if you didn't worship, most nations had many gods, right? We've talked about that. People believed that even if you didn't worship every god that existed in that nation, you better not show a lack of respect toward any god, even the ones you didn't worship. Because why? People believed the gods were vindictive. In other words, they were looking for a reason to get offended. They were looking for a reason to be upset at you. And if you didn't show respect toward somebody else's God, the entire society could be punished because of what you did. And so there was this constant pressure on people to show public respect toward all of the gods. And let me just kind of give you a little example. If you did something foolish to anger one of the gods that I prayed to, then I might pay a price for your behavior, even though I wasn't guilty of anything. You see what I'm saying? That's how people thought. You didn't do anything to anger any of the gods, even the gods you didn't pray to, because you never know what a god might do if they got offended. And so, in fact, there are examples in ancient history where people were actually executed for showing what was called a lack of piety. In other words, a lack of respect toward the gods. If somebody made a stupid comment about another religion, there were examples of them being killed because of that. And so, in the ancient world, when it came to religion, freedom of speech didn't really exist. We're used to the First Amendment, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. If I don't like religion X, I can say what I want about it, all that stuff. Back then, you didn't say bad things about somebody else's gods in case they heard you, and you might be called to answer for it. And depending on the situation, you might answer with your life. So when you have all this in mind, you've got the patriotism, you've got the don't offend the gods, and you've got Nebuchadnezzar's giant ego. Three things all happening here. When you have all that background in your mind, and then you hear about these three Hebrew men that are refusing to bow to this statue, now Nebuchadnezzar's reaction isn't as surprising. Let's go to verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, right, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hand?" So, you notice when you read that, he's not ordering their execution at this point, right? He's giving them one last chance. He didn't have to, but I'm assuming, I could be wrong, I'm assuming he valued their service. They had spent years in training. They had been serving in a high level in the government. And so I think he must have valued their service to a degree, because most people who did this, they would have just been thrown into that fiery furnace, no questions asked. But he gives them this final opportunity to make things right. He gives them a chance to prove their loyalty to him and to Babylon. And again, that's in verse 15. Let's read it one more time. If you are ready, when you hear the sound of and he lists all those instruments, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But we know the story, right? They didn't waste any time thinking about their response. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." And that's a phrasing that means we don't need any time to think about this. We know what we're going to do here. "If this be so," verse 17, right? "Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Now, I want to throw one more thing from a sociological, I'll call it, that's kind of a long word. Yeah, a sociological perspective. I think, just based on the story, that Nebuchadnezzar liked these men, or at least respected them to a degree, and that's why he's giving them this chance. But at this point, even if he wanted to show them mercy, I don't think he really had a choice. Because, here's why. If he spared their lives, well, I'm going to show you mercy anyway, and then something bad happened. And remember, bad things happened all the time in the ancient world, famines, floods, earthquakes, whatever. People would have blamed who? Nebuchadnezzar, the people of Babylon. They would have said, hey, wait a minute. Here we've got this famine, we're all suffering, and it was because these three Hebrew men showed a lack of respect for our gods, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't execute them, and so now we're all suffering, we're all being judged by the gods because the king didn't do what he should have done. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar is an expansionist king. He's out there with his army, he's taking new lands, he's invading new territory, and he's got enough on his plate without doing something to upset his own people who are back at home. And so he's under pressure here. Even if he wants to say to these guys, hey, I'll spare your lives if you just keep quiet, he can't. He's under tremendous pressure. And so that's the situation of these three men. They could bow down to the statue, right? But to do that would be what? Betraying their faith in their God. Or they could continue to refuse to bow and face the penalty, not just of death, but let's face it, a painful death. There's really no good way to die, but there are worse ways to die, right? And being thrown into a fiery furnace, that's got to be among some of the worst ways, right? Now, we know how the story ends, and we'll get into it in the next week or two. We all know the story of the miraculous deliverance, but put yourself in the mindset of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they're talking to the king and he's confronting them, at that moment, they really don't have any idea what's going to happen to them, but to them it didn't matter. They made it very clear that they wouldn't bow whether God saved them or whether God didn't save them. Again, verse 17, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And so that was that. They've got Babylonian society against them. They've got the king against them, and they still refuse to compromise their beliefs. It's kind of interesting for me to look at the end of verse 17 and also verse 18, because essentially it's like they're trying to balance, on the one hand, their faith in God, right? Our God is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us. Faith, we believe. But then you get to verse 18, and they admit the possibility that the Lord might not deliver them. But if not, you see, he will. But if he doesn't, and as Christians, even today, whenever you're in a crisis, you don't have to stand before a king being threatened with death. Whenever you're in a crisis, right? This has always been our reality. As much as we may be convinced that God is going to do something for us, we cannot force God to do anything. I know there are preachers out there that teach you, some miracle formula. I wish I had one that worked, but there is no such thing. You can't make God do anything. And so we express our faith through prayer, and we believe with all of our heart that God's going to provide for us, right? Our God can deliver us, and we believe he will. That's how we are, right? We put our faith in God. But at the end of the day, God is going to do what he's going to do, and I have to make a decision to believe that whatever he does, it fits with his plan for my life. And so in this case, in this story, he does send a miracle. It's an incredible miracle. We'll get into it a little more next week. But there's a passage in Hebrews 11, which I put in your outline, of other people who were just as faithful as these three men, and yet God chose to let them suffer. In some cases, suffer terribly, and in some cases, they died. Let's read it. Hebrews 11, verses 36 through 40. Talking about righteous people. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. Unbelievable. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended for their faith, we're talking about righteous people, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. In other words, their reward would not come in the here and now. It would come after death. Yeah. So you can imagine yourself in a crisis of some sort, whether it's facing a king or whatever. If I'm in a situation like that where it's bad, right? And if I have a choice, I would want a miracle like these three young men in Daniel 3. I would want God to send a miracle my way. But the point is this. I don't get to make that call about my future. God makes that decision because, very simply put, He's the one in charge. And my responsibility is not to try to control the outcome of my situation. I can try to do it through my own actions. I can try to do it by exercising faith, right? There's nothing wrong with exercising faith. We need to. But ultimately, my responsibility isn't to control the outcome. My responsibility is, number one, to stay true to God and to believe that He knows what is best. And number two, I need to recognize that sometimes His will might be different than mine. And I think that's the central lesson. There's a lot of lessons here in this part of Daniel 3, but to me that's what jumped out as the central lesson. I believe we serve an all-powerful God who can do absolutely anything He wants. And I've seen miracles, and some of you have seen miracles, and we've seen the delivering power of the Lord, and it's wonderful when it happens. But at the same time, we need to be convinced that when God doesn't do what we want, we're going to serve Him anyway. So let me leave you one more time with verses 17 and 18, and we'll have our discussion. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up.